The heavy iron gates of Cartwright Mills didn't just creak. They groaned like a dying beast as Evelyn pressed her palms against the rusted bars. Inside the weaving shed, the air was a thick, suffocating soup of industrial grease and ancient soot that coated the back of her throat. Suddenly, a high-pitched shriek of grinding metal tore through the rhythmic thrum of the looms. A massive cast-iron drive shaft snapped with the thunderous crack of a bone breaking, sending jagged shards of steel whistling through the air like shrapnel. As a cloud of scalding white steam hissed from a burst pipe, Evelyn dove for the oil-slicked floor, her silk dress tearing as she scrambled toward a worker pinned beneath a pulsing spray of crimson. In the sudden, ringing silence of the office upstairs, the cold dial of her father's private safe clicked into place under her trembling fingers. She expected the weight of gold or the crisp rustle of currency to save the crumbling empire. But the door swung open to reveal something far more dangerous. Her hands closed around a weathered cardboard folder filled with columns of figures that didn't match the official books. Secret ledgers written in her father's own hand, detailing a shadow world of ghost shipments and vanished millions. Outside, a low, rhythmic chanting began to rise from the street as the shadows of hundreds of workers gathered at the perimeter, their faces illuminated by the flickering orange glow of a torch that had no business being lit. Evelyn Cartwright stepped down from the train car, her lungs immediately recoiling against the thick, soot-laden air of Oak Ridge. Tennessee usually boasted a sweetness in its breeze, but here the atmosphere tasted of industrial decay and ancient ash. Gray clouds hung low, pressing against the jagged skylines of squat brick houses, while distant, skeletal chimneys spewed plumes of black smoke into the heavens. Evelyn adjusted the collar of her dark wool coat, her fingers brushing the silver signet ring she wore out of a cold sense of obligation. She walked toward the Cartwright Mills, her pace brisk, almost a run, until she reached the formidable wrought iron gates. A rusted padlock hung from a heavy chain, its orange oxidation staining the black metal like dried blood. The paint on the overhead sign had long since blistered and peeled, exposing the raw, silver-gray bone of the metal beneath. A stray wind whipped scraps of old newspapers and grit across the cracked asphalt of the entrance. Evelyn reached out, her pale fingers curling around the freezing iron bars. Beneath the skin of her palms, she sensed a phantom vibration of distant looms, and the stagnant scent of machine grease filled her nostrils. The gates remained stubborn and unyielding, a snarling beast guarding its territory against a daughter who had fled to New York years ago, only to return when the heart of the empire stopped beating. The rain hammered against the sea of black umbrellas, turning the cemetery earth into a viscous, grasping mire. Evelyn stood at the very edge of the fresh excavation, her knuckles white as she squeezed a sodden handkerchief. She watched the polished mahogany of Thomas Cartwright's casket descend with agonizing slowness into the dark throat of the Tennessee soil. No prayers reached her ears. Instead, the air carried the muffled, jagged whispers of the townspeople gathered behind her. These men and women, huddled in threadbare coats that had seen too many winters, exchanged sharp, needle-like glances, pointedly avoiding Evelyn's dark, hollow eyes. An elderly woman in the front row, her face a map of labor and resentment, pointedly turned her back when Evelyn reached down to scoop a handful of clotted red clay. The silence of the graveyard felt like a wire stretched to the snapping point, vibrating with an electric current of suppressed rage. Every drop of rain felt like an accusation. Evelyn sensed a trickle of cold sweat sliding down her spine, hidden beneath layers of expensive New York wool, as she realized the hero's burial was a farce attended by people who came to ensure the giant was truly dead. The notary's office was a cramped, suffocating box that smelled of decomposing paper and the stale, sour ghost of cheap tobacco. Evelyn sank into a high-backed leather chair that groaned under her slight weight, facing Mr. Ward. The man's face remained a mask of professional indifference as he spread a fan of yellowed documents across the scarred wooden desk. When Evelyn took the fountain pen, the instrument felt unnaturally heavy. A leaden scepter for a crumbling kingdom. The nib scratched against the parchment, the sound magnified in the quiet room. Dark ink bled into the fibers, anchoring the Cartwright name beneath clauses of ownership and, more crucially, absolute liability. Mestas, Ward adjusted his spectacles, his lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line as his gaze remained fixed on the slight tremor in Evelyn's hand. She forced her signature, a sharp, analytical script, onto the final page. That last flourish of the pen completed the ritual, transforming her into the sole mistress of an industrial ruin. The heavy brass seal descended with a final, echoing thud, marking the papers and her future with the weight of a closing trap. The moment Evelyn pushed through the heavy oak doors of the notary's office, the humidity of the afternoon hit her, along with the presence of 3 men in rumpled, ill-fitting suits. A court bailiff, his face a landscape of bureaucratic boredom, thrust a legal notice inches from her eyes. His voice, loud and practiced, cut through the din of the street traffic, announcing the immediate seizure of assets. Beside him, a creditor in a pinstriped jacket that shone with grease at the elbows began to spray spittle as he shouted, demanding the immediate repayment of a quarterly tranche Evelyn didn't even recognize. She recoiled, her back hitting the wooden doorframe with a jarring thud, the folder of inheritance papers nearly slipping from her numb fingers. A crowd began to congeal around the confrontation, curious and predatory. Someone's rough fingers snagged the sleeve of her coat, pulling at her as if she were a piece of the factory to be salvaged. Figures with 6 zeros danced in the air, shouted by voices that had lost all patience. The roar of the street and the vitriol of the men merged into a singular, deafening cacophony that made Evelyn's ears ring and her throat turn to dust. Evelyn crossed the threshold of the main weaving shed, where the high, saw-tooth ceiling swallowed her footsteps and spat back echoes of cold steel. The roar of the few machines still in operation battered her eardrums, and the floor vibrated with a rhythmic, mechanical pulse that she felt in the soles of her shoes. Out of the gloom emerged Graham Hansen. His face was a mask of grease and coal dust, his massive shoulders silhouetted against the dim light of the gas lamps. He gripped a heavy pipe wrench as if it were a weapon of war. He offered no bow, no polite greeting to the new mistress of the mill. His deep blue eyes burned with a quiet, generational hatred from beneath a furrowed brow. Around them, the workers became statues at their stations, their heavy-lidded gazes tracking Evelyn like a trespasser in a sanctuary they alone had paid for in sweat. Evelyn straightened her spine, forcing herself to meet Graham's piercing stare. An invisible wall of ice and profound distrust solidified between them, a barrier built of decades of exploitation that no polite word could melt. A sudden, violent shriek of metal grinding against metal made Evelyn flinch, her head snapping toward the third row of looms. An ancient cast-iron press began to shudder with a frantic, rhythmic violence, emitting a high-pitched wail that set teeth on edge. Then, the central drive shaft snapped. The sound was a cannon shot, a thunderous crack that echoed through the cavernous hall. Shards of jagged iron casing erupted in every direction, whistling through the air to bury themselves in the brick walls and splinter the wooden floorboards. Evelyn dropped to her knees, her hands flying up to protect her head as a white-hot bolt hissed past her shoulder like a bullet. A pipe burst overhead, and a thick gray fog of scalding steam hissed into the workspace, obscuring the panicked shouts of the men. Graham lunged for the emergency cutoff lever, his muscles straining. But the machine continued to thrash in a mechanical death rattle, vomiting sparks and chunks of mangled steel into the panicked air. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She reached down and tore a long strip from the hem of her silk dress, the expensive fabric yielding with a sharp protest. She dropped onto the oil-slicked floor beside a young worker whose face had gone the color of parchment. Blood pulsed in thick, rhythmic spurts from a deep gash in his forearm. Evelyn ignored the black grease staining her palms and the ruin of her clothes, looping the fabric above the wound and twisting it into a brutal, effective tourniquet. She pulled the knot tight, her jaw set, refusing to look up even as the other workers crowded around, their faces a volatile mix of terror and burgeoning malice. She didn't rise until the frantic pumping of the boy's blood slowed to a sluggish trickle. Graham appeared at her side, offering a piece of clean cotton waste. His rough, calloused fingers brushed her cold skin for a fleeting second. Evelyn looked past him, surveying the hall. She saw the deep stress fractures in the machine bases, the frayed insulation of the wiring, and the weeping patches on the steam pipes. The factory wasn't a place of production. It was a lethal trap, a cage of rusted iron waiting to claim the next life. Evelyn locked the heavy oak door of her father's private office and turned the key twice, the click sounding like a finality. The room was a tomb of mahogany and shadow, smelling of stale cognac and the slow decay of old books. She dropped to her knees in the corner, pulling aside a heavy oil painting of the Cartwright patriarch to reveal the recessed steel face of the safe. Her fingers, trembling with a mix of dread and desperation, spun the dial. She reached into her memory for the combination Thomas had once joked about. A sequence of dates he claimed she'd never forget. The cold metal bit into her fingertips, and each click of the internal tumblers sounded like a heartbeat in the oppressive silence. She held her breath as the final bolt slid home with a heavy, metallic groan. The door swung open on silent hinges, revealing the dark, hollow gut of the vault. She reached inside, her mind praying for the sight of banded currency or gold, anything to halt the creditors and fix the broken bones of the mill. Instead of the salvation of cold cash or bullion, Evelyn's hands closed around a nondescript folder made of thick, drab cardboard. She pulled it into the light of the desk lamp and flipped it open. Inside were sheets of paper covered in the meticulous, upright columns of Thomas Cartwright's handwriting, figures that bore no resemblance to the official ledgers she had seen. She leafed through the pages, her heart sinking as she found invoices for fictitious shipments from companies that didn't exist, and revenue charts that looked like works of pure fiction. In the margins, Thomas had scribbled notes about wire transfers to offshore accounts, funds that had bypassed the factory's coffers entirely. The paper felt slick and oily beneath her touch as the sheer magnitude of the deception settled into her bones. Every page of this shadow ledger was a silent testament to a decade of fraud, a family legacy of theft hidden behind a steel door and a dead man's reputation. Evelyn spread the sheets across the wide expanse of the desk, her analytical mind automatically cross-referencing dates and amounts. Her eyes raced over the lines, identifying a predatory pattern. New loans had been secured solely to pay the crushing interest on older, hidden debts. Thomas had constructed a gargantuan financial pyramid, a house of cards where the foundation wasn't textiles or labor, but empty promises and forged securities. She watched the real assets of the mill dissolve with every passing month in the ledger, evaporating into ghostly numbers on a page. A sharp spasm constricted her throat. She realized with a sickening clarity that the inheritance she had just signed for was nothing but the elaborate scenery of a grand theatrical swindle. The company's treasury wasn't just low, it was empty to the very last cent. A hollowed-out shell of a life's work. Evelyn leaned back into the leather chair, her gaze fixing on the official blue seal of the Treasury Department on one of the grant documents. At the bottom, Thomas's bold signature sat next to the line where Evelyn was now listed as the successor of interest. She understood then that a federal prosecutor wouldn't care about familial grief or ignorance when they saw the evidence of diverted government subsidies. A cold, prickling sweat broke out across her skin. These weren't mere civil infractions. These were felonies that carried the weight of years behind iron bars. Every word in the folder transformed into a weapon pointed directly at her chest. She could almost feel the phantom weight of handcuffs snapping shut on her wrists right there in the quiet of the office. Bankruptcy, which had seemed like a catastrophe an hour ago, now felt like a minor inconvenience compared to the abyss of criminal prosecution that had opened at her feet. Evelyn stood and walked to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool, vibrating glass. Below, Oak Ridge was surrendering to the twilight. The few street lamps flickered to life, casting long, sickly yellow shadows across the street. She watched the hunched, exhausted silhouettes of the workers as they trudged away from the gates, their shoulders carrying the weight of a city that didn't know it had already been sold. The air in Uncle Arthur's private archive was thick with the scent of mildew and the cloying sweetness of old binding glue. Evelyn moved her hand through the gray shadows, her fingers grazing the spines of folders until they snagged on a stack of contracts stamped with the name Green Tex. She had never heard the name in all her years of checking the mill's top suppliers. She opened the first file, seeing Arthur Cartwright's sprawling, arrogant signature across every page. The documents detailed payments for thousands of tons of premium long-staple cotton, yet the delivery dates aligned perfectly with the weeks the looms had stood silent for maintenance. The factory's remaining capital had been bled out through these paper wounds, a systematic siphoning of wealth. She traced the dry, brittle edges of the invoices, realizing she was looking at a map of a slow-motion robbery. Each digit confirmed that while the town starved, Arthur had been meticulously carving the meat from the family's bones. Evelyn gripped the steering wheel of her sedan, her knuckles white as the tires churned through the loose gravel of the back road. The sun was a dying ember behind the Tennessee pines when the headlights of a black SUV flared in her rearview mirror, closing the gap with predatory speed. She floored the accelerator, but the heavier vehicle lunged forward, buffeting her car with a cloud of stinging dust. A sudden, aggressive swerve by the SUV forced her toward the shoulder. She slammed on the brakes, the tires screaming as they skidded across the asphalt, emitting a cloud of acrid blue smoke. The SUV lurched to a halt, blocking the road entirely. Two men with the broad, thick builds of career enforcers stepped out, their leather jackets creaking in the sudden silence. They walked toward her car with the slow, deliberate pace of men who knew there was nowhere for her to run. Evelyn heard the rhythmic click of their heels on the road, seeing in their eyes the cold, professional vacuum of men on Arthur's payroll. Arthur Cartwright didn't bother to knock. He threw the office door open with a violence that made the frames rattle, bringing the scent of expensive tobacco and cedarwood cologne into the room. He tossed a handful of yellowed photographs and a thick laboratory report onto the desk. The images were grainy, but the subject was unmistakable. A younger Thomas Cartwright, standing on the banks of the Clinch River, watching dark, iridescent plumes of chemical waste bloom in the water. Arthur leaned over the desk, his face inches from Evelyn's, his voice a low, rhythmic hiss. He pointed a manicured nail at the charts detailing lead and mercury concentrations, levels Thomas had bribed inspectors to ignore for 30 years. Evelyn saw the glint of triumph in her uncle's eyes. He knew this single file could incinerate her father's memory and turn the Cartwright name into a curse, making them the villains who had poisoned the very children of Oak Ridge. Evelyn stared at the photographs of the iridescent river, and the faces of the sickly children she had seen in the town's clinics flashed through her mind. If she moved against Arthur, If she brought his financial thefts to light, he would pull the pin on this grenade. The truth of the ecological disaster would surface, and the subsequent lawsuits would instantly freeze the environmental indemnity funds that provided the only medical care many of these families had. She felt a phantom noose tightening around her throat. To ruin Arthur was to desecrate her father's grave and strip the town of its last safety net. She touched the edge of the mahogany desk, her fingers trembling under the sheer, crushing mass of the secret. The choice between absolute justice and the survival of Oak Ridge felt like a trap with no exit. And the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like a countdown to an explosion. Evelyn's breath hitched as she stared at the glowing red text on the banking terminal. Transaction denied, account frozen. She had tried to send a desperate wire for a shipment of raw wool, but the system had locked her out. With shaking hands, she dialed the bank's main branch, listening to the long, rhythmic pulses of the dial tone. A voice on the other end, cold and detached, informed her that all Cartwright Mills accounts had been placed under a restrictive lien at the request of an anonymous primary debt holder. Evelyn let the receiver slip from her hand. It hit the carpet with a dull thud. Arthur had cut the last oxygen line. She couldn't buy a single bale of cotton or a gallon of lubricant for the machines. The dark reflection in the monitor showed her own pale, hollowed-out face. Realizing that in less than 24 hours, she wouldn't even have the pocket change to pay the men for their day's labor. The heavy door to the administrative wing shuddered under a massive blow, and Graham Hansen burst into the hallway. His face was a dark, angry red, and the veins in his neck stood out like cords. He slammed his open palm onto Evelyn's desk, making the inkwell dance and the papers scatter. He demanded to know why the pay window was shuttered and why the air was thick with rumors that the machinery was being sold for scrap. Behind him, Evelyn saw the flickering shadows of a dozen more men, their heavy, synchronized breathing creating a low, predatory hum in the confined space. Graham's voice rose to a shout, telling her that the people of Oak Ridge couldn't feed their kids on Cartwright promises while she sat in a mahogany chair hiding the cash. She tried to speak, but he cut her off, his voice cracking with the strain of a man who had reached his absolute limit. The room filled with the sharp, acidic scent of sweat and the raw electricity of a mob in the making. A low, rhythmic rumble began to vibrate through the window panes as the workers of Oak Ridge poured into the square before the main gates. Evelyn watched from the second floor as men and women in stained gray coveralls linked arms, forming a human chain that cinched tight around the factory's throat. No trucks would move. No scrap of fabric would leave the premises. Homemade placards rose above the sea of heads, scrawled with demands for back pay and bitter curses against her family name. The rhythmic thud of wooden slats against metal barrels began to echo through the square, sounding like a slow, deliberate war drum. The strike hadn't just begun. It had ignited like a pool of gasoline. The air outside was thick with a palpable, jagged hatred, and Evelyn felt the walls of the office transition from a place of power into the perimeter of an occupied bunker. The first stone shattered the window in the reception area with a sound like a gunshot, spraying a rain of diamond-sharp glass across the carpet. Evelyn recoiled toward the back wall, her arm shielding her eyes. Outside, she saw Graham Hansen stoop to retrieve another heavy cobble, his face contorted in a silent scream of defiance. One by one, the panes gave way, admitting the biting Tennessee wind and the deafening, chaotic roar of the crowd. She watched the stones strike the brickwork, leaving white scars on the century-old masonry. The barrage intensified, and soon clods of frozen earth and empty glass bottles were flying through the jagged frames. Evelyn huddled in the corner of her office, watching the symbols of her family's status disintegrate under the hands of the very people they had treated as mere extensions of the machinery. The overhead lights flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the factory into a heavy, suffocating darkness. The constant hum of the ventilation system wound down to a haunting silence, replaced only by the muffled, rhythmic chanting of the mob outside. Evelyn knew with a sickening certainty that Arthur had pulled the main breakers at the substation, choosing to paralyze the mill entirely rather than let her maintain control. In the sudden gloom, she heard the frightened shouts of workers still inside the plant, their voices echoing off the dead looms. The loss of light was the final signal. Arthur had stripped her of her last defenses, leaving her blind and helpless in a building that was no longer hers. She felt for the heavy brass pen stand on her desk, her fingers closing around it as the cold began to seep into the unheated room. A thunderous crash echoed from below, the sound of the main oak doors finally splintering under the pressure of the crowd. Evelyn heard the heavy, rhythmic stomp of dozens of boots on the marble stairs, the sound ascending toward her floor with terrifying speed. She lunged for the door, throwing the deadbolt. But she knew the thin wood was a joke against the weight of the men outside. She was trapped on the top floor, the exits blocked by the very people whose lives her family had ruined. The ventilation ducts carried the jagged edges of threats and the sound of furniture being smashed in the foyer below. She looked at the windows, but they offered only a view of the angry sea of protesters. The walls felt as if they were closing in, and every heavy thud against the wood below vibrated in her skull like a hammer. In a frantic search for some means of defense or escape, Evelyn's hand struck a hidden catch in the back of Thomas's desk drawer. A false bottom clicked open, revealing a leather-bound photo album. She flipped it open to a random page and froze. There, in a sharp black-and-white photograph, were a young Thomas and Arthur, standing shoulder to shoulder by the river's edge, tipping a rusted, leaking drum into the current. On the back, in Arthur's precise, arrogant hand, were the words, "Our shared legacy." The realization hit her like a physical blow. The disaster wasn't a mistake her father had made, but a cold, calculated plan they had executed together to save on overhead. Arthur held this over her because he knew he would sink with her, and he was betting she didn't have the stomach to drown them both. The photograph felt hot in her hands, a piece of evidence that bound her family to the poison in the soil. The office door was kicked from its hinges with a violent crack, and Graham Hansen stood in the jagged opening, his chest heaving, his face a mask of dust and sweat. Behind him, the hallway was a sea of shadows and angry, glinting eyes. Graham took a slow, deliberate step into the room, his fists clenched at his sides. He didn't look at the desk or the safe. He looked directly at Evelyn, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He demanded she look at him, really look at the people she was starving, before the factory and everything in it finally met its end. Evelyn stood frozen under Graham's accusatory stare, but the words she meant to speak died in her throat. A thin, rhythmic hiss began to emanate from the floor vents, followed seconds later by a plume of oily, gray smoke. The air in the office suddenly tasted of scorched rubber and bitter chemicals, triggering a chorus of dry, racking coughs from the men in the doorway. Evelyn pressed her hand to her throat, the toxic mist stinging her eyes and burning her nostrils. The smoke coiled across the ceiling like a living thing, rapidly erasing the faces of the workers in a thick, gray shroud. Graham spun around, his head snapping toward the sound of a distant, muffled roar and the unmistakable sharp scent of accelerant. Evelyn watched as gray flakes of ash began to settle on her hair like a morbid snow, her eyes watering as the first waves of heat began to radiate through the floorboards. Graham's head jerked toward the far end of the corridor as a jagged, orange glow erupted, reflecting in the sweat on his forehead. The finished goods warehouse, packed to the rafters with synthetic rolls and treated fabrics, had become a massive tinderbox. Evelyn heard the fire before she saw the flames, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that sounded like a freight train barreling through the building. A sudden wall of heat rolled down the hallway, causing the varnish on the office doors to blister and pop. Arthur had chosen his moment with a serpent's precision. The main stairwell was now a chimney of rising fire. Graham slammed his fist against the doorframe, the realization of the trap settling into his features. The exit was gone, buried under tons of melting polyester and roaring flame. Black serpents of soot began to climb the walls, and the plastic handles on the filing cabinets began to sag and drip. Evelyn dropped to her knees before the safe, ignoring the searing heat of the steel handle. Her fingers fumbled with the dial, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as she finally wrenched the door open. She ignored the jewelry and the remaining petty cash, her hands diving for the shadow ledgers and the brittle, yellowed maps of the spill sites. She shoved the documents into a heavy leather satchel, her knuckles white as she buckled the straps. Graham was shouting at her, his voice nearly lost in the roar of the fire, telling her to leave the paper and save her life. Evelyn didn't look up. She gripped the handle of the bag as if it were a lifeline. These pages were the only weapons she had left against her uncle. She felt the air in the room thinning, turning into a searing weight that scorched her lungs. But she wouldn't let go of the truth she had finally found. The workers in the office began to panic, smashing the remaining window panes with chairs. But the 3-story drop into the jagged debris below made escape a death sentence. Evelyn's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and analytical even in the face of death. She pointed toward a narrow, rusted iron door in the corner, a relic of the building's original construction that housed a manual freight lift. She grabbed Graham's arm, pulling him toward the cage. She knew the ancient cables were a gamble, capable of holding only a few people at a time. The screech of metal against metal echoed through the room as the first group of men scrambled into the cramped, vibrating box. Evelyn stood at the manual winch, her face slick with sweat and soot, while the floorboards beneath her feet began to groan and crack from the inferno devouring the level below. Evelyn shoved the heavy leather satchel into Graham's hands as he tried to pull her into the swaying lift cage. She shook her head, her eyes fixed on the thickening wall of smoke at the end of the hall where the central archives were located. Graham reached for her wrist, his voice a desperate growl, but she wrenched herself free and disappeared into the gray haze. She dropped to her stomach, crawling along the floor where a thin ribbon of breathable air still lingered. Her lungs felt as though they were filled with broken glass, and black spots danced in her vision. Behind her, she heard the rhythmic clang of the lift's safety gate as it began its slow descent, leaving her alone in the belly of the burning mill. A thunderous crack vibrated through the floor, and a massive, flame-wrapped ceiling beam plummeted from the darkness, slamming into the floor inches from Evelyn's head. A fountain of white-hot sparks stung her skin, leaving a constellation of red burns across her arms. The path back to the elevator was instantly erased, replaced by a wall of roaring heat and splintered glowing timber. Evelyn pressed her body against a row of steel filing cabinets, the metal already too hot to touch. The heat was so intense it felt like a physical weight, singing her eyebrows and making her vision blur. She was trapped in a cul-de-sac of brick and fire, where every shallow breath was a gamble against unconsciousness. Graham erupted from the smoke like a ghost, his clothes smoldering and a wet rag tied across his face. He hadn't stayed on the lift. He vaulted over the smoldering beam, his boots kicking up a spray of embers, and caught Evelyn just as her knees buckled. She felt the raw power in his calloused hands as he hauled her upright, his muscles straining against the weight of the air itself. He didn't speak. He threw her over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, his breath coming in ragged, rhythmic gasps through the cloth. He charged back into the inferno, his body shielding hers from the falling debris, and lunged toward the narrow maintenance ladder that led to the roof. Evelyn and Graham burst through the roof hatch, collapsing onto the flat, tarred surface of the annex. They lay there for a moment, greedily gulping the frigid night air. From this height, the square below looked like a scene from a nightmare, illuminated by the flickering, hellish light of the main building's collapse. Evelyn looked down and saw a black sedan parked just outside the perimeter of the heat. Arthur Cartwright leaned against the hood, his silhouette sharp and composed. He was watching the destruction of his family's history with the calm detachment of a man watching a theater performance. He slowly raised a cigarette to his lips, the orange tip glowing as he took a long, satisfied drag, entirely unaware of the two survivors watching him from the heights of the burning ruin. The workers on the square looked up, their faces illuminated by the orange glare, and spotted Evelyn's silhouette against the flames. A low, rhythmic murmur of discontent surged into a unified roar of fury. To the exhausted, frightened people below, the sight of the mistress on the roof was the final proof of her guilt. They saw a woman who had torched her own factory to erase the evidence of her debts and their stolen lives. Murderer! Thief! The cries rose up, echoing off the surrounding brickwork. A bottle shattered against the parapet near Evelyn's feet, spraying glass across the roof. She recoiled, realizing that in the eyes of Oak Ridge, she was the monster who had set the world on fire. Graham stepped in front of her, his body a barrier against the rising tide of stones and hatred. Graham gripped Evelyn's shoulder, guiding her toward the narrow, vibrating rungs of the external fire escape. He forced her down the ladder, descending directly into the heart of the human storm. The moment her boots hit the pavement, the crowd surged forward, a wall of angry, soot-stained faces. A hand reached out, snagging her hair, but Graham delivered a sharp, rhythmic shove that sent the attacker reeling. He used his elbows and his sheer mass to carve a narrow path through the mob, his back taking the brunt of the blows from sticks and fists. Evelyn felt the heat of their breath and the sting of their spit, but Graham remained an unyielding stone in the current. He pulled her tight against his side, absorbing the collective rage of the very men he had spent his life leading. Evelyn didn't cower. She reached out and gripped the rough fabric of Graham's sleeve, pulling him close until their foreheads almost touched. She clutched the scorched leather satchel to her chest, the documents inside still warm from the fire. She shouted over the roar of the mob, her voice cracking but clear. She would be at the town hall tomorrow at noon. She pointed to the bag, promising to lay bare every cent Arthur had stolen from them over the last 20 years. Graham saw a flash of cold, analytical iron in her eyes that made him hesitate. He gave a sharp, decisive nod, and the gesture acted as a silent command to his inner circle. Evelyn wasn't asking for a reprieve. She was demanding a trial, her fingers locked around the evidence that would either save the town or bury her with it. Under the watchful, silent guard of 4 men Graham had handpicked, Evelyn began the long walk into the dark, labyrinthine alleys of Oak Ridge. She didn't look back, but she felt the atmospheric shift as the roof of the main office finally gave way. A thunderous, rhythmic booming shook the earth beneath her feet as the brick walls collapsed inward, sending a pillar of sparks into the black Tennessee sky. The Cartwright empire was a pile of glowing rubble. But for the first time since she had arrived, she felt the weight of the shadow ledger and knew she finally held the power to strike back. Evelyn sat on a rickety wooden stool in the corner of Graham's small kitchen, the air smelling of damp wool and the sharp, metallic tang of wood smoke. A single bare bulb swayed from a frayed wire overhead, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the cracked linoleum. She dipped a piece of gray rag into a basin of freezing water and began to scrub her skin, the friction turning the soot stains into a raw, angry red. The charred remains of the ledgers lay across her knees. She used her fingernails to delicately separate the pages, careful not to crush the brittle, blackened edges. Her pencil moved with a frantic, rhythmic precision, underlining the names of the shell companies Arthur had used to bleed the mill dry. Outside, the Tennessee wind shrieked through the gaps in the window frame, a cold reminder of the world waiting for her at dawn. Graham set a chipped enamel mug on the table, the steam carrying the bitter, earthy scent of oversteeped tea. He leaned against the doorframe, his face a landscape of exhaustion and hard-won resolve. He told her that Arthur had already moved. The doors to the town hall were open, and he'd spent the night filling the front rows with his own foreman and the local shopkeepers he'd bought off. According to Graham, Arthur was passing out promises of a new, modern plant and free whiskey, building a human wall to protect his claim to the town's future. Evelyn took a slow, painful swallow of the tea, the heat a sharp contrast to the chill in her bones. She looked at Graham, seeing the flicker of a reluctant alliance in his eyes, a shared understanding that the coming hour would be their only chance. The heavy oak doors of the town hall groaned as they swung open, and Evelyn stepped onto the polished, echoing floorboards. The air inside was a thick, humid soup of human breath and the smell of wet coats. A wall of rhythmic, deafening whistling hit her the moment she was spotted. The workers in the back rows began to stomp their boots, creating a thunderous, predatory vibration that shook the very air. Arthur sat at the center of the high dais, his silk tie perfectly knotted, watching his nieces approach with a mask of practiced, oily sorrow. Evelyn walked down the center aisle, her chin up, her gaze fixed forward, even as the shouts of "traitor" and "arsonist" pelted her like stones. Her fingers were locked around the handle of the satchel, the only thing keeping her upright in the face of the town's collective loathing. Arthur rose to his feet, his hands gripping the edges of the podium with a calculated, statesmanlike grace. His voice, amplified by the cavernous ceiling, was a masterpiece of mournful authority. He leveled a manicured finger at Evelyn's soot-streaked face, describing her unfortunate mental collapse as a tragic family trait. He sighed for the crowd, spinning a tale of how she had personally put the torch to the archives to hide her own embezzlement before fleeing to New York with the remains of the payroll. The room surged with a new wave of rhythmic, angry murmurs. Arthur played their fears like a seasoned musician, his words a rhythmic poison, while Evelyn stood at the base of the stairs, watching a single frantic bead of sweat roll down his temple, the only sign of the panic clawing at his insides. Evelyn didn't wait for an invitation. She climbed the stairs and shouldered Arthur aside with a cold, rhythmic efficiency. She didn't ask for silence. She simply unbuckled the satchel and laid the first charred ledger directly under the lamp on the podium. Her voice was a dry, analytical blade as she began to read the names. Northside Logistics, Tech Service Inc., Vector M. She called out the exact amounts, thousands of dollars, that had moved into Arthur's private accounts during the same weeks the mill's canteen had run out of flour. The shouting in the hall died away, replaced by a silence so profound the rustle of the papers sounded like a crack of thunder. The workers leaned forward, their faces frozen, as Evelyn's voice became the only rhythm in the room, stripping the skin off Arthur's lies with every line she read. Evelyn reached into the bag and pulled out the yellowed photograph of her father and Arthur standing by the blackened river. Her voice lost its analytical edge for a moment, trembling with a raw, jagged honesty as she admitted the truth. Her father had been a part of the poison. She looked directly at the elderly weavers in the front row, acknowledging the decades of ecological theft her family had committed to pad their own pockets. She didn't distance herself. She claimed the shame as her own, standing before them as the heir to a legacy of ash and sickness. The hall remained motionless, the air thick with the weight of the confession. By refusing to hide, by standing in the ruin of her father's reputation, she ceased to be the distant mistress and became a woman who shared their scars. Arthur lunged forward, his face a mask of purple rage, his fingers clawing for the documents on the desk. But before he could reach the paper, Graham Hansen stepped into his path, his massive chest a wall of scarred denim. Behind Graham, 4 more workers moved in a silent, rhythmic synchronization, their heavy, calloused fists clenched at their sides. Arthur recoiled, his heels catching on the legs of his chair. The polished veneer of the businessman shattered, leaving behind a frantic, cornered animal. He looked toward the side exit, his eyes darting like a trapped rat's. But Graham's men already held the doors. Evelyn watched him, seeing not the powerful uncle who had threatened her on the road, but a hollow man whose stolen world had finally collapsed. Evelyn reached back into the satchel and pulled out a final document, fresh and crisp against the charred remains of the ledgers. With a slow, rhythmic movement, she signed her name at the bottom, the scratch of the pen echoing through the silent hall. She announced that she was placing the Cartwright estate, the mansion on the hill, and every cent of her personal inheritance into a community trust for Oak Ridge. The funds were to be used for a new hospital and the long-overdue cleanup of the river. She laid the pen down and stepped back, having stripped herself of the last of her privilege. She stood before them in a ruined dress, her hands stained with ash, possessing nothing but the truth she had told. The rhythmic thud of heavy boots announced the arrival of the police as they pushed through the rear doors. Graham stepped forward, handing the lead investigator the scorched remains of a gasoline canister and a list of witnesses who had seen Arthur's men at the substation. Evelyn watched as the cold, rhythmic click of handcuffs echoed through the room, snapping shut around Arthur's wrists. He tried to shout about his influence, his voice rising in a shrill, desperate pitch. But it was drowned out by the low, guttural roar of the town's contempt. The officers led him away, his feet stumbling on the very stairs where he had stood as a king an hour before. Evelyn closed her eyes, listening to the sound of the law finally collecting the debts her family owed. Evelyn stepped out onto the stone porch of the town hall, squinting against the sudden, sharp glare of the Tennessee morning. Her pockets were empty, and the keys to the mansion lay on the table behind her. She began to walk down the cracked sidewalk toward the factory, her worn shoes kicking up small, rhythmic puffs of gray dust. As she neared the gates, she saw them. Hundreds of workers, already moving among the ruins. Without orders, without the promise of pay, they were clearing the charred brick and hauling away the twisted skeletons of the machines. The scent of the fire still hung in the air, but beneath it was the smell of wet earth and new beginnings. Evelyn stopped at the gatehouse, looking at the blackened ribs of the main hall, which no longer looked like a grave, but like a foundation. Graham Hansen approached her, wiping his blackened hands on a piece of oily waste. He didn't offer a smile, but he handed her a heavy, rhythmic thump on the shoulder that carried more weight than any formal thank you. He handed her a pair of thick leather work gloves, their surface scarred and worn. Evelyn pulled them on, the fit snug and protective. She looked at the looms being salvaged from the wreckage, and then at the men waiting for a direction. She took a breath of the soot-stained air, her mind already beginning to organize the chaos into a plan, and stepped into the ruins to begin the work of building something that finally deserved to stand.